as we move into the period after the Reformation, a lot of these ideas serve foundational purposes in shaping where nations are going to go in these later periods. So you have, for example, the Puritans in England, and then later so you have in England and later in New England, largely following a lot of the things that Calvin had laid out, where the government can enforce religious duties and moralities. Heretics face both a religious trial and a civil trial. And so as the Puritans end up in New England and Massachusetts, right, first as the Pilgrims and then a larger community comes over, you know, there are a variety of laws that the Puritans established about what you could and couldn't do on Sunday. You have to show up to church services, laws against certain types of immorality, including swearing. Right, so really trying to establish a society that is governed by religious law. On the other hand, in England, you have some, as you go through the 1600s, some very important ways in which English political philosophy is taking on a more secular types of tone. Both Locke and Milton were shaped by Puritanism, but neither of them were truly orthodox Puritans. And ultimately, they're beginning to have some differences about the role that government should play in society and that the church should play. So Milton, for example, argued for things like the freedom of the press, the overthrow of oppressive monarchs. There's a high emphasis on the individual conscience, as well as moral agency. Locke, on the other hand, had similar thoughts, but also emphasized, you know, a different role for government to maintain peace and safety and security. He's really not interested in this kind of godly prince that Luther supported. Right? The citizens were to be the upholder of virtue, not the state. So citizens need, in Locke's mind, need to be able to pursue their own interests. So ultimately, for Locke, as we've talked about elsewhere, reason becomes the criteria for making decisions about God and morality, and the magistrate or the ruler has to respect those moral judgments. As Locke wrote, a magistrate can right me against my neighbor, but cannot defend me against my God. He further on says the magistrate has no more certain or infallible knowledge of the way to attain a right relationship with God than I myself, where we are both equally inquirers, both equally subjects. All right, so religion and state should be separate, is what both Locke and Milton to some extent, but Locke more fully, is arguing for, that there needs to be this clear distinction between the two, because the government cannot in any way help a person make religious moral decisions. And this, of course, will become very influential on the founders in thinking about the role of separation of church and state. Something similar taking place in France. In Catholic circles, you know, the question of, right, I mean, largely we were talking about Protestant circles. What are the Catholics thinking about? In France, France had a lot of rights and concessions from the papacy due to a variety of things that took place there, rights that other countries didn't necessarily have. Well, at various times, especially in the post-Reformation period, the Catholic Church tried to assert more authority over France, and the French government often kind of balked against that. And so, ultimately, two different groups developed in France. The Gallicans were people that were, you know, kind of interested in more of a separateness between the Catholic Church and France. The Ultramontanes instead were those people who looked to the Catholic Church. And so, they were the ones that wanted to see close connections. So you have this one group wants to have the distinction between France and the Catholic Church, others that want closer ties. And of course, within all of this is the question of those Protestant heretics, which there are these attempts by earlier French kings to give Protestants rights, but as France and the Church are kind of interconnecting there, the Edict of Fontainebleau is released, which takes away all of those protections and argues or orders all Huguenots, these French Protestants, to convert to Catholicism. So, even though there is this kind of debate, there's still this pressure at various times to try and assert religious power through political means. As we move further into the 18th century especially, there is more of this development of this separation of church and state. We've mentioned the Enlightenment several times, and with its emphasis on reason, the importance of the individual conscience, the Enlightenment thinkers further developed this notion of the state being secular and distinct from religious authority, especially in a situation where you have all sorts of religious diversity. A lot of the Enlightenment thinkers felt that the state should not be in the business of choosing which of these churches is right and then enforcing that on everybody else, because they have learned from the past, the recent past, and the various wars of religion that take place in the period after the Protestant Reformation, as different states attempt to enforce, either Catholic kings enforcing Catholicism on their subjects or Protestant kings enforcing Protestant on their subjects. Right? There's the 30 Years' War that takes place in Europe that embroiled a lot of Europe over these kind of issues. And so the Enlightenment really pushes forward that the more rational choice is to allow people their freedoms and separate church and state. And of course, as we get into that in the United States, or the American colonies into the United States, the War of Independence is an example of how this is playing out in the development of a new nation. And what's part of what's taking place here, largely a political thing, but there are some religious connections, and there are some important religious consequences out of this, where part of the groups that are participating and encouraging the War of Independence are groups that have faced suppression or faced persecution or faced challenges because of the Anglican Church's control over the colonies. So that's included here as well, and why there is such support for the First Amendment, which gives freedom of religion. Right? So Congress shall make no law favoring an establishment of religion. Right? So you have the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which means there's not going to be a state church or national church, and then make no laws prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so no laws against the practice of religion. Now, Congress has made plenty of laws prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Some of those have been good, some of those are questionable, because the question becomes, well, whose free exercise is worthy of being protected, especially when it comes to certain Native American practices, when we think of certain things that have taken place with like Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses. There have been various cases where Congress has passed laws prohibiting the exercise of those two groups among others as well. Another important question in all of this is the question that continues to have political import today, and that was America founded as a Christian nation? There are a lot of people today who would argue yes, it was, and because of that yes, there are certain things that should be taking place now. There are a lot of other people who would argue no, and because of that no, there are certain things that should be taking place now. It's a very complex question because of some of the basic issues. When it comes to just the term Christian, what do we mean by Christian? And we talked about this early on in one of the early lectures. If we're talking about belief in a certain set of doctrines, a lot of the founders did not believe in some of those doctrines because of their influence in the Enlightenment. A lot of common people did, but a lot of the people creating the founding documents, Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, you know, they didn't always have a lot of those orthodox views, especially about Jesus. On the other hand, if we're saying, well, the Christian has to do with the importance of religion in a public sphere, the importance of religion and morality for good citizenship, yeah, I mean, there's definitely that. But there's, you know, it's a very complex question that doesn't have an easy answer because of some of the things that we're talking about and identifying here, right? For the Enlightenment, there is this notion of religion being a private matter, but that, you know, the importance of morality for social good. The First Amendment, of course, does not have the phrase separation of church and state, but in trying to talk about what the First Amendment was in the early 1800s, Thomas Jefferson talked about there is that wall of separation, right, that he saw between church and state present in the First Amendment. And the reason he brings this up is because he is asked by a group of Baptists in Connecticut about it because they wanted there to be a separation. Because in Connecticut, they had to pay taxes to the Congregationalist church, the church that grows out of the Puritans. They were Baptists. They didn't want to have to do that. Right? So they're wanting separation between church and state. And of course he writes this saying there's this wall between church and state. And then the next day he goes to the House of Representatives for a church service. Right? Separation of church and state. So even though there's supposedly this wall, other people have said, other scholars have said, there's a lot of checkpoints, right? Places where you can move between the two of them fairly easily. And so we've never had true separation of church and state, but we've had a lot of discussion in America about what that relationship is. Where are some places where church and state can work together? Where are some places where the state has to say, no, we're not getting involved in that? And what kind of influence should churches have in the public sphere and in the state?